The New York Times recently published a new expose on the NFL and some of their ties to the tobacco industry, especially when it comes to the issue of concussions and the way the NFL studied concussions, lobbied or worked with lawyers and lobbyists when it comes to these concussions, and the way that they put out information about them. Now, the NFL didn't like the report, of course, because it makes them look really bad. So they wrote to the New York Times and wanted a retraction. But the New York Times was not about to have it. Now, let me give you a little more context about their story. What the New York Times found was while the NFL was studying concussions, there were a number of professional athletes that were retiring early because they were really concerned about their mental health. Well, at that time, the NFL releases this study talking about how, no, there's no long-term damage. Everyone needs to calm down. But their studies were very flawed. In fact, they found that about 100 diagnosed concussions were omitted from these studies, which is, of course, disastrous. You can't have that. And Steve Young and Troy Aikman were among the professional athletes that were not included in the studies. So obviously there are some flaws there, and the New York Times wrote about it. Then they found that the NFL worked with the same types of lawyers and professionals that helped protect the tobacco industry when the tobacco industry was pretending as though smoking didn't lead to any long-term health consequences. Now, after that report came out, the NFL was pissed. This week, NFL lawyers sent a letter to the New York Times demanding that the Times' recent investigation into the league's bogus concussion studies be retracted. The New York Times responded back with the following. As you know, the Times has a policy of correcting factual errors as promptly as possible. I have reviewed your letter with our editors and reporters, and nowhere does your letter identify any factual error that we have made in our reporting on the ties between the NFL and the tobacco industry. The crux of the letter is the NFL's complaint that the connections identified by the article between the NFL and the tobacco industry were not meaningful. Obviously, that is an opinion, not a fact. Look, I've criticized the New York Times in the past for certain articles, especially during the time of the Iraq War when we decided to invade, right? But this is a perfect example of the New York Times standing up to a huge organization.
A huge organization that's historically had its way when it comes to beating even another massive industry like Hollywood when the movie Concussion. You remember that?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. I'm just glad that the New York Times has no vested interest in airing NFL stories, because if that were the case and they were making some substantial advertising revenue from that, you know how quickly they would have retracted everything and it would have been like, everything's good, concussions don't exist. I swear to God.
Well, maybe there wouldn't even be the need for a retraction. Maybe
they would have never aired, yes.
Yeah, they maybe would never have written the story in the first place. So
well, coming at this as a comedian, it's just some really good comic writing, I think. It's
Yeah.
snarky, hits everything, but it's informative. I really enjoyed it, and it's so rare that you get to see this in journalism, unfortunately, when you have, again, like what Hasan was saying, standing up to a major corporation. That's awesome.
Yep.
And it kind of made me a little bit sad, to be honest, because you just don't see it that often anymore, where someone can kind of nut up and do it, and in such a...
Nut up.
Nut up. I haven't heard that expression
Nut up
before.
Or shut up, NFL.
This is when I'm going
Grace
to remind
Baldridge.
everyone that I am from Belgium, and I think I misused that expression.
Nut up.
You know
sounds
what? The
dirty.
nutting up.
That sounds like a sexy man.
They hid evidence. They did what NFL does, and they used the same lobbyists and consultants. And it's so foolish on the NFL's part to go out and make this a bigger deal than it actually is.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to bury it. Of course, the New York Times is going to respond like, no, suck it. That's an opinion, not a fact. And then also, here are the facts that we're not going to retract because they're fucking facts.
Look, and also, there of course was a huge lawsuit against the NFL for not disclosing the impact of these concussions and all these, head injuries. And as a result, they agreed to settle with former players for $765 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but once you divvy it up among all the players that were impacted by this, it wasn't much. And think about the number of players who literally killed themselves because of the head injuries that they sustained from playing the game.
You know why the amount wasn't that big? Because they used the awesome lawyer teams that Philip Morris, the same tobacco industry that the NFL apparently called odious, which I
Yes.
do not know what that word means, but it sounds, it sounds like something mean.
It's a negative. It's,
Okay,
it's
it
not
sounds
good.
negative.
Yes.
But the same industry they called odious, they happen to also use that awesome defense team to make sure that settlement was as low as possible.